Hi, everyone. Good to see you again here this year at Consensus. Excited to be here as always. The way that our industry really started and the way that Chainlink came about, I think, was at the intersection of two key trends. It was a growing distrust from society of existing systems and institutions, and it was the kind of universal understanding that oracles and smart contracts are a better way to process transactions and create trust relationships. Now I feel we're at a unique point in time when we're adding a third category of what Chainlink and our industry is about by basically merging the global financial system into the blockchain industry. So at this Consensus conference, it has the most banks, asset managers, financial market infrastructures of any of the past conferences. And I've definitely been having more conversations, and really the most conversations, with central banks, digital asset custodians, banks themselves, and a whole bunch of big institutions. So I think we're now at a point in time in our industry where all of these things are starting to intersect and create a very unique opportunity to redefine how the world works. This is also proven in numbers. So at this point, the real-world asset tokenization trend has surpassed DeFi. So DeFi is now priced at 107 billion in total value locked, and the tokenized real-world asset trend is at over 160 billion. So we're kind of at another tipping point here where the amount of value that you're seeing in this real-world asset, digital asset tokenization trend, even on public chains, has now surpassed DeFi. And this isn't even counting all the value in private chains, bank chains, and all those more private systems. So it's even more value than that. The world we're going to is still the world where all the world's value, all credit, all derivatives, all commodities, everything is basically on-chain and represented on-chain and composable on-chain into more and more advanced financial products in an efficient, quick way. So we're not talking months, we're talking minutes to seconds. Right now, what takes months will take minutes to seconds. And as more and more assets get on chain, they'll become composable and they'll begin to create their own kind of benefits from being composed into more and more advanced baskets of things. So right now, we're basically in the position where we're at a tipping point where the numbers have far surpassed what they were in the past. And we're on a trajectory where all the world's biggest institutions are starting to look at how to put their value on chain. So I would say that basically this year is the year when our industry shifts into this new direction about public chains and about the global financial system merging into a single industry, into a single internet of contracts. Now, to do this, we basically, in my opinion, need to have three things happen. The first thing that needs to happen is that data and value need to become tightly coupled. So data and value right now in the traditional system are separate, but connecting data and value into one system, I think, is very powerful because it allows the data to prove things about the value in an ongoing real-time manner, which is a very big improvement. The second big trend is that the asset transfer system and the system of payment for the asset can merge into a single universal layer. And that single universal layer creates the third thing, which is the global internet of contracts. So the global internet of contracts is really what we're all going towards, in my opinion. We're all public chains and private bank chains merge into a single connective layer of all of the different chains interacting with each other around different forms of payment and different assets. That includes central bank digital currencies, stable coins, all kinds of payment systems, and all kinds of assets, everything from real estate to traditional financial assets. So these are the three big dynamics that are now technically happening. Chainlink is driving all three of these dynamics forward by providing the data, the additional computation, and the cross-chain connectivity in a single platform. So one of the very important aspects of doing this correctly is that there is a single global standard for how data flows into and out of and between assets and how those assets themselves move across these systems. And Chainlink is, at this point, the only platform that provides the data, the additional computation, and the connectivity across chains in a single platform to allow those assets to prove things about themselves, to allow them to move across chains while proving those things, and to allow them to remain secure and synchronized with existing systems for the ability to scale. So let's walk through a kind of high-level example. So if you're making a real-world asset, the first thing you need to do is inject data into that asset. And the more basically traditional that asset is, the more pieces of data it needs. The more traditional an asset, the more identity it needs, the more price data it needs, the more NAV data it needs. Basically, in order to make a real-world asset, and then to make a real-world asset that's actually compliant, you need many layers of data to go into the asset. In creating this asset, you're making what we call a unified golden record. So it's a single on-chain record that houses both the ownership rights and the data attached to the underlying asset, continually updating that smart contract about that asset, right? So if something changes about the asset, the underlying asset's change should lead to an update in the smart contract. And that's very different from the world today, where updates about assets happen once a year, once a quarter, or once a month. Here we're talking about updates about assets once a second. So it's a very significant change, especially if that difference between once a year and once a second is a significant amount of risk. An example of that risk is something like the global financial crisis. The second problem after you inject data into the asset and you form this unified golden record is actually the ability to move it across chains. And the reason you need to move it across chains is because it has to gain access to purchasing power and liquidity. It has to become exchanged for value, for payment, for central bank digital currency, for stable coins, for tokenized deposits, for many different forms of payment in these other chains. And as the cost of generating a blockchain continues to go down, all banks, asset management firms will have not just one chain, but multiple chains. And all of these chains will need to interconnect with each other to transact. So your first problem is getting data into the asset to turn it into a real-world asset that is continually updated with critical data. Your second problem is moving that asset across chains so it can participate in transactions and be exchanged in delivery versus payment transactions for stablecoins, central bank digital currencies, or whatever form of payment happens to exist on that chain. Your third problem then becomes, as the asset moves across chains, how does it remain synchronized with data? Because the fundamental value of this more advanced asset, this unified golden record, is that it is being updated by data every second rather than every year or every quarter or every month. But it's moved, right? It's moved from your first chain to your second chain to a third chain to a fifth chain. How does data reach it? All three of these problems are solved right now by various Chainlink Oracle networks providing data, creating connectivity, and continuing to feed data into the transaction. Without all of this data, initially to form the asset, to allow the transaction to happen, and then for the asset to function when it reaches its destination, you really won't reach a high-quality, robust set of assets that are also superior because they're connected to data in a useful way, which is the first tenet of what I think we need to achieve. The second tenet is merging data and payments into a single flow, which is the cross-chain portion. And then the third one is, the second one creates data native contracts. And the third one is really the ability to synchronize all of this activity with existing systems. So in addition to generating the asset, and in addition to moving the asset across chains, if you're actually going to do this at scale, you need to synchronize all of this activity on various chains, on blockchain A, blockchain B, C, D, E, all the chains that the asset moves through. All of that activity needs to be synchronized back to the asset manager systems, the bank systems, the CSD systems, and in some cases, the central bank systems. Without this synchronization with those existing infrastructures, you will not reach scale, basically. You can do one or two transactions, you can do some small amount of transactions in some kind of pilot regime or some limited framework. But in order for us to reach hundreds of trillions of dollars in our industry, you need value to flow into our industry in a way that's synchronized within the current infrastructures and the current standards. So this is where Swift messages and all those types of kind of standards come in and are quite important. So just to walk through some examples. Our work with the DTCC shows that you clearly need a way to put critical information on chain in order for fund tokenization to go to the next stage. So fund tokenization is probably one of the biggest categories of real-world assets that's just now emerging, and it's dependent on critical data like NAV data. NAV data is basically the valuation of the underlying fund, and without putting NAV data on chain, you fundamentally can't move the administration of the fund on chain. So this initial body of work with the DTCC basically moved the information that's critical for funds to be tokenized on chain. It did that in a way that will work cross-chain, and it did it in a way that simplified the management of this critical piece of data across over 10 of the world's largest asset managers. So it's pretty clear that the first step in creating tokenized funds and bringing all of these assets on chain is bringing the necessary data for the assets to function correctly on chain. And this is the same pattern that we had in DeFi when Chainlink launched and took DeFi from a sub 100 million total value locked industry to an over 200 billion in total value locked industry. It was basically the same pattern, is that without the data, you cannot get the assets on chain and you cannot get them to function. So it's now playing out again, just in this much, much larger form in the current global financial system. Another example of critical data is our work with the ARK ETF, where proof of reserves proves that the fund actually has assets in the amount that it claims at every moment in time. So second by second, it's proven that the fund's assets are in line with the value of the fund as represented. And this is something that we've seen multiple people on Twitter and other platforms say has led them to switch from other ETFs to this ETF, because they now have more information, they have proof about the solvency and the underlying assets of this specific fund. And this is on production. So this is live on production today, securing real value. On the cross-chain side, in addition to working with many of the largest protocols in the Web3 public blockchain space, which I'm sure will eventually convert to a CCIP-driven system on the basis of security, which is the basis on which the data side of Chainlink has become widely adopted, is that the security of these systems is actually an inescapable kind of requirement. Whether or not people initially accept it, as the security issues of other protocols and systems are seen, the most secure kind of cross-chain protocol is already, in our case, as CCIP, emerging as the thing that people are switching to for security reasons. In the banking sector, we've already conducted transactions in pilots and POCs where basically stable coins have been exchanged for tokenized carbon credits and other real-world assets. And this has been done with users with over 1 trillion assets under management per user. So in this case, you have a single bank, ANZ Bank, one of the largest banks in Australia, with over 1 trillion in assets under management, conducting a delivery versus payment transaction using a stable coin in exchange for a carbon credit. Now that's a pretty serious thing, because imagine if there was a DeFi protocol that had 1 trillion assets under management. We would all be very excited. And then the question would be, well, how many such protocols could exist? But in the global financial system, banks like ANZ are not uncommon. So I think the sheer size of what the global financial system moving into the blockchain format means is really not to be underestimated. Even if a very small percentage of the value in users like this transfers into stablecoins and carbon credits, tokenized real estate, tokenized equity, tokenized anything, then we're looking at a multiples increase in the size of our industry. And frankly, I don't really know myself where that type of increase in the size of our industry would come from, other than the traditional financial markets. because the retail community and the prop trader community and the hedge fund community, in my opinion, will only take our industry to maybe 10 trillion, but it won't be able to take it past that, in my opinion. I think if we want our industry to reach hundreds of trillions, which is what we're all working towards, in my opinion, we really need the global financial system to become compatible with blockchain technology and to form a single internet of contracts where all forms of payment and all assets can freely and efficiently flow across both large institutions and small fintechs in one big internet of contracts, just like we are all on one big internet today, right? We're not in separate internets. We're on one big internet. The banks are on the internet. The fintechs are on the internet. Everyone's on the internet. And so that leads us to kind of the final body of work of how to interface the existing financial systems, the existing global financial system with blockchains in an efficient way. And my view is that this is most easily done by integrating with existing systems and existing standards. So existing systems and existing standards for 50 years, more than 50 years in digital form, have allowed transactions to reliably happen. There's hundreds of trillions of dollars on these systems and standards. And realistically, what's needed is not a wholesale replacement of them, but the ability for them to migrate value and to interact with blockchains in an efficient, secure, reliable way. So that things like Swift messages can trigger blockchain transactions, and things like Swift messages can be used to put more and more value on chain over time. And this is, I think, the path that's going to most easily get all of this value on chain, and that's going to grow our industry past 10 trillion into the hundreds of trillions. And it's also the path we're working on with many large standards. Much of our work with Swift is already well known, where we're integrating with that standard and other standards to make sure that the value that lives in the global financial system doesn't stay there. It migrates into the blockchain format and forms this new internet of contracts of interconnected chains working on a single protocol like CCIP. So this is the world that we're actively working towards, which in my opinion is beneficial for everybody. It's beneficial for the public blockchain industry because that value will migrate and interact with public blockchains. It's beneficial for the global financial system because of the security, reliability, and risk management that all of this provides. And it's generally beneficial to society because better financial markets, better global financial systems avoid things like the global financial crisis and allow emerging markets to become basically capable of having savings accounts and all kinds of other economic kind of levers that people need to live a good life and have an economic future. So this is the body of work that we're involved in, interconnecting all of these kind of systems, CSDs, central banks, CSDs on the asset side, central banks on the payment side, and basically everybody that wants to exist in a single internet of contracts where they can transact, whether they're a big institution or whether they're a big fintech or whether they're a small DeFi protocol, just like everybody's on a single internet, whether they're a small startup or a fintech or a big institution, right? So we just need to replicate this dynamic and then we can hit real scale for our industry. Right now, there is a dividing line between these two worlds. There's the Web3 world that's already largely running on Chainlink Dons, using Chainlink data, using all kinds of Chainlink services to power the top DeFi protocols. And now we're in a place where the TradFi world is migrating to a world of connectivity, also through Chainlink data, also through Chainlink identity, also through Chainlink as a connectivity layer, feeding that critical information into those smart contracts. There is still a line between these two worlds. That line is driven by regulation and legal issues, but that regulation is coming very rapidly at this point, and those legal issues are being forcefully resolved by the courts and by different countries' own regulators at their own pace, namely in Asia and the Middle East, leading kind of those clearer regulations at this point. Once that line and that barrier between these two worlds disappears, you basically get a single internet of contracts, and that single internet of contracts requires standards. It requires data standards to transmit information. It requires connectivity standards to move value and information across different environments. Similarly to how HTTPS helped the internet transmit critical information like credit card numbers to allow e-commerce to emerge, and similarly to how TCP/IP unify different networks, internet networks into a single global internet. That's basically the body of work. And the project that we've undertaken is making that same set of standards, the same set of basic technical building blocks for the blockchain world of how does data flow into, out of, and between blockchains and smart contracts, and how does value flow into, out of, and between blockchains. And once these standards exist, you can rapidly accelerate what goes on chain, the quality of how things are proven about it, and how transactions can flow between small entities doing really innovative things and large entities with large amounts of capital. So I think we're at a kind of threshold for this as well, because never have we seen so much activity on Chainlink and so much usage of all these different services. And I think that this year is the year when you're going to see the capital markets actively also utilizing these systems to generate real transactions across different chains of their own, or pilot transactions across chains of their own. And then next year, I think you'll start to see some amount of scale, in my opinion, or some amount of growth in this. But we are all going to arrive at a single Internet of Contracts where all of these systems interoperate and need highly reliable data to prove things about themselves and their assets to each other, to regulators, and to consumers.